All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're uncovering a hidden linguistic code, tracking down the historical detectives who actually cracked it, and investigating a totally fascinating anomaly from 1820s America. Seriously, if you love a good historical mystery, you are in exactly the right place. We're going to dig into a puzzle that has completely captivated linguists, historians, and statisticians alike.
So here's our detective's corkboard for this explainer. We'll be looking at decoding the Chiasmus, a timeline of discovery, the Book of Mormon anomaly, the heart of the message, explaining the origins, and finally, the statistical improbability. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Decoding the Chiasmus. What exactly is this hidden literary device? To kick off our investigation, we've got to understand the tool at the very center of our mystery.
So, what are we actually looking for? Well, a chiasmus, or chiasmi if we're talking plural, is this brilliant ancient literary and rhetorical device. Basically, it's where concepts, words, or even massive grammatical structures are introduced and then repeated, but in reverse order. It forms an A-B-B-A pattern. It gets its name from the Greek letter chi, which literally looks like an X. So think of it as a mirrored reflection of ideas. It's kind of like walking into a room, noticing the objects on your left, then the center, then your right, and then describing them backwards as you walk back out. And here's the really cool part. In the ancient world, way before the printing press, people had to pass down these huge, complex epics orally. This mirrored structure, it was an incredibly powerful memory aid. It let storytellers mentally map out massive blocks of text without ever losing their place.
Now, notice how this ABBA structure builds directly toward that crucial C block right in the middle. We start with idea A, move to idea B, and then boom, we hit step 3, pivot point C. This is the literal heart of the structure. After that, we just mirror back out. Idea B is repeated, and finally, idea A is repeated. Now, you might be thinking that pivot point is just a casual transition, right? Nope, it is absolutely crucial. It's the most important central message the author wants to highlight. The entire passage is architecturally designed to point you straight to that middle idea. It's like a giant bullseye, and every single sentence is an arrow pointing right at the center.
Moving right along to Section 2, a timeline of discovery, the search for ancient patterns. Let's trace the historical scholars who slowly, painstakingly decoded this exact pattern in the Bible.
You know, uncovering this ancient pattern was definitely not an overnight thing. Early scholarship on biblical chiasmus only started gaining real traction in the 18th and early 19th centuries. In 1773, Bishop Robert Loth published lectures popularizing the broader concept of Hebrew parallelism. Fast forward a bit to 1820, and an English writer named John Jebb first categorized chiasmus as a specific mirrored form of parallelism in the Bible. He called it epinodos back then. Then, from the 1820s to the 1850s, theologians like Thomas Boyes and John Forbes really expanded on how these structures functioned in Scripture. Just think about the sheer amount of work involved here. These scholars had to meticulously scan incredibly dense ancient texts, line by line, without any modern computers or search functions. It took over 2 centuries for European academics studying Greek and formal English to identify these structures, and this slow, steady crawl of academic progress actually culminated in a pretty surprising discovery in 1967, when a missionary named John W. Welch found and documented complex chiastic structures hiding right inside the Book of Mormon while he was in Germany.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Book of Mormon anomaly, a linguistic puzzle in rural America. This gets us to the core historical mystery of our explainer. How did this complex, ancient device end up in a text from 1820s America?
Let's set the scene here because the contrast is wild. In the 1820s, Joseph Smith, who published the Book of Mormon, was a young, largely uneducated farmer living on the rough frontier of upstate New York. We're talking dirt roads, intense manual labor, and super basic rural schooling. Meanwhile, at that exact same time across the Atlantic, formal academic literature on chiasmus was pretty much locked away in the elite halls of Oxford or deep inside German theological institutes. The papers were written in ancient Greek or highly academic English. It wasn't something the general public would even know about until way later in the 20th century. So the crucial takeaway here is that scholarly and secular consensus pretty much universally agree it is incredibly unlikely that a young frontier farmer like Joseph Smith would have had any awareness whatsoever of this super obscure European academic concept. The gap between his world and elite European academia is just staggering, and yet, the structures are undeniably right there in the text, ranging from tiny verses to massive sweeping chapters.
Section 4, the heart of the message, the Alma pivot point. We need to zoom in right now to look at a famous, incredibly complex chiasmus found in the Book of Mormon narrative of Alma.
The text, known as Alma 36, is widely considered to be the most complex and robust chiasmus in the entire Book of Mormon. It maps out this deeply dramatic narrative of a spiritual conversion using a meticulous, multi-layered structure. To really get this, you have to understand the context. The first half of the chapter, our ideas A and B from earlier, describes this intense spiritual agony, immense guilt, and a feeling of literal, suffocating darkness. The narrative builds and builds the tension until, bam! It hits the center, the C block, and that's the quote you're seeing right now. Now, as my mind caught hold upon this thought, I cried within my heart, O Jesus, thou Son of God, have mercy on me, who am in the gall of bitterness, and am encircled about by the everlasting chains of death. Placed directly at the exact center of this sprawling structure, this plea for mercy is the beating heart and the absolute pivot point of the passage. And here's where the magic happens. Right after this plea, the second half of the chapter mirrors the first half perfectly, but in reverse. The intense pain from the first half is directly mirrored by profound joy in the second half. The suffocating darkness? Mirrored by intense, radiant light. Everything before the pivot leads up to this moment of begging for mercy, and everything after it reflects back on the resulting redemption. It's just a stunning, chapter-length piece of literary architecture.
Section 5, Explaining the Origins. Two sides of the debate. Since Smith likely didn't know what a chiasmus was, we've got to act as impartial forensic reporters here and weigh the evidence.
Like any really great historical mystery, there is a fierce debate over exactly why this pattern exists in this specific text. On one side of the scale, apologists and religion scholars argue that, well, because Smith couldn't have possibly known about complex chiastic structures, finding them in the Book of Mormon is hard linguistic evidence of its ancient Semitic origins. For them, it's undeniable proof of antiquity that he simply couldn't have faked. On the other side of the scale, historians and skeptics perfectly balance this out with naturalistic explanations. They point out that chiasmus can actually emerge totally naturally in repetitive, speech-based oral traditions. They also argue that heavy biblical influence could naturally produce these patterns. If a writer's mind is just totally saturated with the rhythm of the King James Bible, it might happen subconsciously. Plus, they caution that sometimes we modern readers might be subjectively forcing this device onto texts, finding patterns where none were actually intended. So the big question is, are we looking at an ancient translation or an incredibly impressive subconscious mimicking of the King James Bible?
And that brings us to Section 6, the statistical improbability, running the numbers on chance. To wrap up our investigation, let's look at the raw statistics behind a multi-layered structure happening spontaneously.
What are the actual odds of an extended, word-for-word, chiastic structure occurring purely by accident? Well, researchers who analyzed this stuff regarding narrative prose ran the numbers, and they concluded that there is less than a 0.02% chance of a complex structure like Alma 36 happening spontaneously. To put that into perspective for a second, a 0.02% chance is essentially like flipping a standard coin and getting heads roughly 12 times in a row. It is statistically jarring.
Or, to put it the way some physicists and statisticians have argued, it's an astonishing anomaly with less than a 1 in 100,000 chance of happening purely by random accident. Just pause and think about the weight of that math for a moment. 1 in 100,000. When you look at the sheer numbers regarding narrative prose, the deep intentionality behind the structure becomes incredibly hard to dismiss as just a mere coincidence. Someone or something definitely built that chapter on purpose.
So, we've traced the ancient roots of the chiasmus, followed its painstaking academic discovery, and unpacked the sheer statistical improbability of its appearance in 1820s rural America. As you look at all the clues we've laid out in this explainer today, I want you to ask yourself, is this complex structure a divine ancient pattern? Is it a remarkable subconscious borrowing from a biblically saturated mind? Or is it simply a 1 in 100,000 mathematical fluke? What do you believe is the true origin of this incredible literary mystery?